Welcome to Chapter 12. Chapter 12 moves into a new section, Section 3, or a new unit, in which we're talking about the environmental health and safety. You know, the environment, we oftentimes think of it as being about birds and maybe, raccoons and things that are like nice, but, when it comes to us and the important things, we think of like going to work and cars and things like that. But the truth is that the environment supports all of us, and so without the environment, you're going to have a lot of problems, and in fact, there are a lot of problems occurring because our environment is more toxic than it was in the past. And so we're going to go ahead and talk about environmental health and safety in this chapter. So, what are environmental hazards? So environmental hazards are factors and conditions that increase the risk of human injury, disease, or death. Right? And so this chapter is about the hazards that exist and efforts that we make as a society to protect ourselves against them. So we're going to start with air. Air pollution is contamination by gases, liquids, or solids, and they can be either natural or man-made in their source. When you think about our transportation system, we have motored vehicles, and those produce a lot of like off gases, or most motored vehicles, they are burning fuel and then have a byproduct that's oftentimes hazardous, like carbon monoxide. And there's stationary sources like coal, like power plants, for instance, coal, which is probably the worst, and oil. And then there are industries themselves, which are mills and refineries and other industrial production sites that are burning fuels and the smoke or other pollutants as byproducts. Maybe they're burning things, or maybe they're mixing things together, and then there's a air pollutant byproduct to that. So, all right, there are primary pollutants where the source is where the pollutant is coming from, right? So for instance, if you were to smell the muffler smoke of your car, that muffler smoke is a primary pollutant, and it is toxic in and of itself. And then there's secondary pollutants, and those are created from mixing the original thing with something else, like sunlight, right, or energy. Right? All right. The Clean Air Act is the law that gives the federal government the ability to address air pollution. It does things like it regulates the emission standards for vehicles, and it measures the air quality for urban areas. The EPA, or Environmental Protection Agency, is charged with setting, maintaining, and enforcing environmental standards. And if industries or individuals are violating those, they can levy fines against those. They set limits on the amount of air pollution that is acceptable, right? With special attention being paid to critical pollutants. Critical pollutants are those that are especially harmful toward humans. And progress is being made in reducing these. So, on page 301, there's a chart that looks at page 301 in our textbook looks at the color grading system that is used in American cities as a way of communicating the level of pollution that is present in that usually urban area. Right? All right, but let's go inside and look at what's going on the inside of buildings. Right? And so you think about the outside as being, you're subjected to smoke and other pollutants in the air, but also inside there are building materials that are off-gassing. There is combustion products. So for instance, if there's indoor heating, like a fireplace or even a furnace that can have air pollution, furniture, paints, cleaning supplies, radon, tobacco smoke, all of these things, you could argue, maybe perhaps in some places, are actually more dangerous to us because they are more contained within a smaller area that we're in. There's asbestos, which is a fire retardant. That means they put it in things, or at least they used to put it in things. It's now illegal to use in buildings, but for many decades they were in love with it because it prevented things from catching on fire. Unfortunately, it is also a carcinogen. There's biogenetic, and these are of biological origin, so they're alive, and these are things like fungi and bacteria, molds, pollens, animal dander, and these are oftentimes in our homes, right? And so most of the time, most people probably are not going to be experiencing symptoms of distress, but the children whose lungs have not fully developed, the elderly, and people with breathing problems are the most susceptible to these issues. So our book recommends keeping the humidity in our home between 30 and 50% as a way of reducing air pollution. Diving into a few specific types of air pollutants, there are volatile organic compounds, and these are vapors that irritate our bodies, create headaches, memory impairments. Sometimes they're even a carcinogen. This means cancer causing, right? These are present in building materials and cleaning products and deodorants, eyeliners. Unfortunately, some of the things that we put directly on our body, like makeup, is going to be pretty toxic for us. Insecticides are things that kill insects, electrical equipment, formaldehydes, and these can come in things like bags that we would bring from the stores, wallpapers, and then other construction materials. Unfortunately, many of the things that we make, that we spend lots of time in, can be really hazardous for our health because of the materials that we're building those things with. So, radon is the number one cause of lung cancer among people who do not smoke, equaling about 21,000 deaths per year. Unfortunately, radon does not have a smell or taste. It is naturally occurring in the ground, and so if we have a basement, for instance, it can seep through that. So fortunately, though, our homes can be tested. We can have a radon tester that we would install in the home, and that's a good thing to have. Secondhand smoke is when somebody passively breathes in the smoke from someone else's, usually cigarette. Right? All right, our indoor air, unfortunately, is more polluted than our outdoor air. There's less air movement. It's more contained. There's more sources of pollution than if we were outside. So our book recommends that we spend 50 to 90% of our book suggests, our book estimates, though, that for many people, they're spending the majority or the vast majority, between 50 and 90% of our time, we're spending indoors. All right, well, let's move on to talk about water pollution. Right? So if you look at my chart here, there's 3 water sources. There's surface water, and this would include things like lakes and ponds. There's groundwater, and that is, the water that is below the surface of the topsoil, the soil that's immediately visible. And then there are aquifers, which are underground, usually larger sources of water, but they're a little bit deeper than the groundwater. So, water pollution is a change in the water that can harm living things, or deems it unfit for other uses, such as swimming or fishing or agriculture. So if you have water and it's safe, and then there's a change where now the water can harm living things, this is, the definition of water pollution. There's 2 types of water pollution. One is from the direct source, and so this is where the water has changed because of some identifiable source, such as sewage or industry, waste product going into the water source. And then the second one is non-point. And this is where it is difficult to identify why the water has become poisoned. It may be due to runoff, or it's something is seeping into the water, maybe miles away from where it's identified. Basically, it's hard to find out where that's coming from. So there's two types of pollution. There is biological and non-biological. Biological is that which is coming from living microbes, fungi, or viruses. And then non-biological is that which is coming from non-living things, oftentimes mercury and other heavy metals. I mentioned that makeup is a potential source of pollution for our bodies. Right? Pharmaceutical pills is another potential source. They recommend that people don't flush their unwanted medications down the toilet. You can bring them to drop-off centers, or you can bury them in cat litter and pour water over it, and it's going to be unusable at that point. But shampoos and soaps and sunscreens, oftentimes these things are untreated even though they go through our water treatment centers. So each U.S. resident uses between 80 and 100 gallons of water per day, and this is just for domestic use. And so this is not going to include industry use or agricultural use. By the way, agriculture and industry use a whole lot more water than residents do. So the treatment facilities, they get 2/3 of their water from surface water and then 1/3 from groundwater. So most treatment facilities, which is what creates our public water sources, when you turn on the tap in most of our towns, 2/3 of that comes from surface water, such as lakes and streams and rivers, and then about 1/3 of it comes from groundwater. That's the thing initially right under, or it can be right under the ground. So there are lots of steps in treating wastewater. The first one is where a clarifier separates the the solids from the liquids. The second step is where aerobic bacteria and oxygen is added to break down the organic waste that is within the water. Step 3 is sedimentation, which is where you allow the heavy materials to fall to the bottom. Step 4 is disinfection, and the fifth step is discharge, wherever that water is going to end up, it's going to head there, whether that's back into the water system or that's into a stream or other source. The Clean Water Act and Safe Drinking Water Act is what gives the Environmental Protection Agency the power to set the standards for water quality and to enforce them. I will say that unfortunately, the EPA is not as strong or well-funded as it could be, and therefore many violations to it occur, and most of the time they do not get any sort of fine or punishment. Let's look at food, right? The truth is that the food in the United States is actually very safe compared to other countries. So, yay for America. Unfortunately, foodborne illnesses still claim about 3,000 lives per year, and we will sometimes have foodborne disease outbreaks where 2 or more people have a similar case, and it is related to the fact that they had common food. Every once in a while, you'll hear about like a salmonella outbreak on lettuce or spinach or something like that. The neurovirus is the leading cause of foodborne disease outbreak. Salmonella, second leading causes. And this is often caused because cooking temperatures are not sufficient, right? Or the holding temperature for something is not high enough, or people are drinking raw milk. Paint on the walls, or if there's old toys, and unfortunately, these can lead to a host of psychological and physical problems, especially for the most vulnerable, and that's going to be children who are very good at putting things in their mouth as a way of learning about it. So, all right, moving away from the home that we live in and going to the place where we work. The place where we work is the second place that we spend the most time in. And here we can inhale a lot of toxic chemicals that cause asthma and pneumonia, especially if one works at a mine or a quarry or foundry or a place that uses explosives, a blasting site, and glass manufacturing. But If you are in an office building like I am, that doesn't mean that I'm immune, because you remember many of the building products that are used, especially if the building's a little bit older, like can have asbestos in them, or the carpets could have toxins that are used. In fact, I know the carpets have toxins in them. So, I mean, most man-made products that we create have some level of toxin in them, and they off-gas throughout their life. It's probably the most off-gassing in the beginning. Like, when you get a new car, it has that kind of new car smell to it, and we associate that with a good thing, but the reality is that's the chemicals from the seats and the plastics from the dashboard kind of leaking out, and we're inhaling that. And then after a while, if you own the car for a while, it stops smelling like that. And so, but the most exposure is when things are brand new, and there are other things like the pillows that we use, and oftentimes have things like formaldehyde in them and all kinds of other toxic chemicals. But moving on, going back to the workplace, the farms, another place where people are exposed to lots of toxic chemicals. Especially pesticides, where people sometimes are working in the fields while a drone or a plane or some kind of machinery is on top over them, spraying it onto the plants that they're working on, which means they're spraying it onto them. Moving on away from the places where we work to natural disasters, and these natural disasters could be like floods or earthquakes, hurricanes, in which the environment is going to expose humans to more toxins than they are able to deal with, that it may lead to injury or death. And so some of these would be like radiation, and so the sun is shining on us all the time, or X-rays, or nuclear power that could come from nuclear weapons, or it could come from nuclear power plants. Floods have a way of moving toxins out of one environment where they were contained into a bunch of other ones. Whenever there's like a monsoon or a flood in an area, the initial concern is people being swept away in their cars into the water. But then the second concern is people who are in the water. That water has been mixed with potentially sewage and lots of other contaminants that could make people sick, especially if they have like a cut on their leg or something like that. So terrorism and war in general, the explosion or the weapon is the initial concern. Did somebody receive part of the shrapnel of the weapon that went off? But then after that initial damage, oftentimes the weapons themselves have toxic chemicals in them that can poison the environment around them. And so how do we respond? So when it comes to specifically natural disasters, the FEMA, which stands for Federal Emergency Management Agency, plans for disasters and has equipment in various parts of communities to try to respond when there are natural disasters, giving people warnings, giving people supplies when those disasters come. And then on the private side is Red Cross, and Red Cross tries to work with the government to provide housing, temporary housing, obviously, when a natural disaster happens, like a fire for a family, or even if, say, power were to be cut off for a community, they may have generators where they have like a common sleeping area where people can go and have light and power and heat and things like that. Otherwise, we mentioned the different agencies, the Environmental Protection Agency that specifically sets limits and punishes people and organizations when they exceed those, and then the Food and Drug Administration that oversees food, except for meat and dairy, and there's a separate agency that is over those. And so, but I think overall, Politicians don't emphasize this, and so there's a lack of laws regarding this. If you think about, the coronavirus and the amount of energy and attention that politicians focused on this, and then compare that to air pollution and water pollution, there's just no comparison, because these sort of pollutions or contaminants, causes for concern to our health, just don't come anywhere near to a virus or something like that. So, all right. Well, that is the end of this chapter.